Okay, we're going to continue with our discussion of metaphysics, particularly one subtopic within metaphysics, the philosophy of the self. We've moved into the modern period of discussion of the philosophy of the self. And let me say that questions of the self, mind, and soul are tied up with questions of personal identity. Now, it's natural to think that if we have a self that is changeless and eternal, then that self is what gives us our personal identity. But what if the self changes over time? Does it remain the same self? Something in us is inclined to say that even things that change retain their identity over time. Now, for example, imagine that 40 years after you graduate from Delaware State University, you return for a reunion of your graduating class. Your returning presupposes that you have returned to the same university you graduated from. That something essential has remained the same. But would the university really be the same? There'd be many new buildings, many new degree offerings, a new administration, new professors, and possibly the university grounds will have expanded. What will have remained the same that makes it the same university? Possibly only its name. But is the same name alone sufficient to say that the university you return to is identical with the university you attended? And we can't even be confident that the name will survive over time. Names of colleges and universities have changed over time. In fact, my understanding is that Delaware State University's name has changed over the years. I don't know what those names are, but I can give you another example. Consider the case of Rowan College in New Jersey. It was first named Glassboro Normal School. Then it was named New Jersey State College at Glassboro. And then it was named Glassboro State College. And then it was named Rowan College of New Jersey after a benefactor by the name of Rowan gave it some money, and they changed the name of the university to Rowan College of New Jersey. Yet, even if Delaware State University changed its name, and in many other ways it changed as well, you'd probably be inclined to think that it somehow retained its identity. Now, the problem of change over time and our tendency to think of identity remaining the same in spite of change concerned the philosopher John Locke. Let's talk about John Locke. His last name is spelled Locke. Now, John Locke lived from the mid 1600s to the early 1700s. Excuse me. He worked as a physician and later got some political jobs. Locke believed that to answer the problem of personal identity, we should not seek one answer that will fit every possible kind of thing. He believes when we ask how something retains its identity through time, we need to first identify the kind of thing we're talking about. And he identified 4 different kinds of things: atoms, complex bodies, living organisms, and persons. First of all, let's talk about atoms. Locke believed that atoms don't change, that they are distinct in space from each other. There is therefore no problem about saying that atoms retain their identity over time. Now, regarding complex bodies, by complex bodies, Locke means anything that has mass. Locke says that there is no problem with complex bodies retaining their identity over time as long as the body's atoms keep the same position in the body and as long as new atoms aren't added to the bodies or atoms aren't lost from the bodies. But that's probably not true of any mass. They all change. When they change, they are no longer the same body. But does this mean that the changes that occur in the bodies of living organisms cause them to lose their identity? No, says Locke, because there is something else we must consider in the case of living organisms. Now, about living organisms, he said this: living organisms are different from non-living masses, even though both undergo changes. The difference is this: the changes that go on in a living organism have specific functions, namely to grow, to be nourished, to acquire and discard certain characteristics. It's these functions occurring within the body of living organisms that give them their identity. This is true of plants and animals. But why only plants and animals? Why not humans? Locke says personal identity is different with persons. It's different from plants and animals. It's more complex. Now, regarding persons, Locke had a lot to say. For example, while Locke does not deny the existence of a soul, he believes that personal identity isn't related to the soul. And here's why. For the sake of argument, he says, so suppose reincarnation is true. Suppose a soul can be transferred from body to body. We might be inclined to say it's the same person moving from body to body. But what would we if they are significantly different? If they had a different personality? If they didn't retain their memories from a previous lifetime? Would we, if a soul of a person ended up in the body of a hog, say it's the same person? It seems like we wouldn't. According to Locke, personal identity is evidenced by retaining the same consciousness over time. Consciousness is the self. But what ensures us that it's the same consciousness that exists over time? Locke answers, having a memory of being the same person when recalling a past event. That is what ensures us it's the same consciousness that exists over time. And I'm going to quote something from Locke. He says this, quote, "For as far as any intelligent being can repeat the idea of any past action with the same consciousness it had of it at first, and with the same consciousness it has of any present action, so far it is the same personal self." Now you should write this down because it will be on your final exam. John Locke holds a memory theory of personal identity. Let me put this down, say that again. John Locke holds a memory theory of personal identity. Now, there are some problems with Locke's memory view of personal identity. First of all, there's forgetfulness. We forget things. Does that mean we forget part of our identity? And when we go to sleep at night, we're not remembering things about our life and our past. And what if we suffer from amnesia? We lose our memories altogether, or most of them. Has our identity significantly changed? And then he considered the case of drunkenness. What happens when a person gets drunk and they do things that they don't remember the next day doing? Does that mean they were a different person when they were behaving a certain way when they were drunk? Or does that mean that that they are the same person? And if so, how? If memory is the key to personal identity. Now, John Locke admits all these are legitimate problems with his view, and he concedes that personal identity arguably changes when and if these events occur. The only exception he made was in the case of drunkenness, because he thought that you should say it was the same person who committed the act when they were drunk after they're sober, because it's important to be able to hold people accountable for their actions. But as far as the rest of them are concerned, he conceded that that personal identity changes when those things occur, when memory is impaired in some fashion. Now, the next philosopher that I want to talk to you about is David Hume. David Hume, and his last name is spelled Hume. David Hume, Hume. He was born in the early 1700s and died in 1776. He worked as a merchant's assistant, writer, tutor, and personal secretary. Now, Hume has some important things to say about the self. According to Hume, when you examine the contents of consciousness, you learn that they are nothing more than a series of impressions. The impressions of ideas and the impressions of our senses. But even our ideas are based on impressions that we generalize from our sense experience over time, because it's convenient to work with generalities than to treat each experience of the same things and events as brand new. Now consider the sun. The sun you see today isn't the same sun you saw yesterday, because it's gone through enormous physical changes since then. But it's convenient to develop the general idea that it's the same. But most importantly, for us, we only experience our sense impressions of things and not the things themselves, the objects beneath the impressions. As far as we are capable of knowing, says Hume, there are no objects behind the impressions. We only know the impressions, and impressions come and go. They don't persist over time. Now, how does this apply to the idea of the self? Well, here's Hume's basic argument about the self, and you should write this down because this will be on your final exam, and I'll go slow so you can write it down. Number one, all ideas come from impressions. All ideas come from impressions. Number two, the idea of a self that exists over time comes from an impression. Number two again. The idea of a self that exists over time comes from an impression. Number three, but impressions don't persist over time. Number three, again, but impressions don't persist over time. Number four, therefore, we cannot know that there is an object we call the self that exists over time. Number four again. Therefore, we cannot know that there is an object we call the self that exists over time. So now, more rapidly, the entire argument goes this way. Number one, all ideas come from impressions. The idea of a self that exists over time comes from an impression. But impressions don't persist over time. And number four, therefore, we cannot know that there is an object we call the self that exists over time. So what is he saying? What he's saying is that our ideas, the ideas that we have about things, are the result of impressions upon our mind. And that the idea that we have of a self is itself an impression. And the idea that exists over time is an impression that we have. But the truth of the matter is if you really think about it, impressions don't persist over time. When you're asleep most of the night, you're not having the impression of an enduring self. So therefore, he concludes, we cannot know that there is an object we call the self that exists over time, because the impression of it doesn't exist over time. So we can't be sure that the self exists over time. Now, if you recall earlier in the course, when we talked about the Buddhist notion of the self, it had ideas very much like this, in denying the reality of the self. And Hume is casting a great deal of skepticism on the reality of the self. That's all I have for this lecture. Thank you.